shadows of stone. She stood on the edge of my mind. I tried to push her away.
No, you're not imagining things. What you see in this title is indeed the name of this group. There have been worse names for musical groups like the entirety of 55 Gore, Limp Bizkit, The Band. Yeah, what the fuck were they thinking when naming this one the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band? Are you kidding me? I don't mean to be all salty already for this retrospective, so names aside, what even is this band? Chances are you haven't actually heard of them since they started in the 60s, they weren't very successful, and they disbanded only after like 5 years and 6 albums. I'll warn you right now, apart from the occasional image of some of the band members floating around, this band has no footage of themselves, at all. No live footage, no music videos, no interviews, nothing. This is a band, rapidly becoming lost to time. And yet their story is one of the more interesting ones that I could tell you from the tidal wave of groups from their era. Musically, they were competent enough to warrant shows and a little success, and they perfectly fit the time period, not to mention fitting their own name with their music, but for the most part, their career was marred by one man who pretty much claimed everything the band did for himself. This man's name was Bob Marley. Not to be confused with the overrated reggae artist. The story of Bob Marley is a good lead up to the history of this band because of how much of a monetization individual with a concerning amount of power over the group he seemed to be. He had an easy life growing up, being adopted into a wealthy family, and he graduated from law school before hosting an Oklahoma television show. Interestingly enough, he didn't consider himself privileged according to people who had worked with him. He was just interesting. Apparently he tried making music from a solo career first, and because of his connections was signed with Warner Brothers Records, even though he really didn't possess much musical talent. Needless to say, it didn't last too long. Then Marley hosted a concert at his mansion in Los Angeles that involved the Yardbirds, who were getting big at the time, and a band comprised of teenagers named The Laughing Wind. Marley was apparently impressed by the crowd the Yardbirds were gathering, especially the presence of young women fawning over some of the bands and members there. And he also liked what the Laughing Wind was putting out, so he decided he wanted to join that band to get the same success and reaction himself. Now, instead of just, asking and auditioning like any other aspiring member of any other band, Marley decided he'd use his connections and wealth to convince these young whippersnappers to let him join the band in exchange for funding and a record deal with FIFO Records, which was a label co-founded by, you guessed it, Bob Marley. My guess is because the guys in The Laughing Wind were just starting out and were like, bro, this guy is rich and he knows his stuff, they agreed to work with Marley. And thus the rabbit hole was dove into. Violently fisted. Marley's first official act as member, manager, label owner, basically boss, was to rename The Laughing Wind into the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band, presumably because he thought it would attract attention for how weird a name it was, even for the time, simultaneously ensuring that nobody would want to draw in the extra air to their lungs to say the full name of the band and possibly contributing in some way to the fate the band received throughout their career. Anyways, after making the band name as goofy as Post Malone's beard or as pretentious as painting 32 soup cans, Marley made the stunning realization that a rock band only attracts chicks if they have actual music to play at their shows. Who knew? Thus, he helped the group in the later stages of development of their first album, released in 1966, titled Volume 1. Volume 1 could be seen as a unique little thing since it was already nearing completion when the band was under the name of The Laughing Wind, only to be later repurposed as a West Coast pop art experimental band record in the later parts when Marley came around. And at times it can be noticeable. Regardless of who did what instrumentally or lyric-wise, that did not stop him from claiming the primary writing credit for most of the original tracks for himself. even if he had little to no part in the process. In fact, let's get this little tidbit out of the way to prevent too much unintended repetition. Due to his superior knowledge of law and business, Markley managed to not only claim ownership of the band's name, but he also gained control of their output as well, like what the name of the album would be, what it was about, what was and wasn't included on albums, etc. You get the point. So yeah, if you haven't noticed by now, I think he was a bit of a cock, but hey, capitalism! Yeah! Get ya Paul! A large chunk of this album is cover songs, out of like 11 tracks on here, which is alright for a debut, but not really fun to hear. Most of the time a band should start out with a few covers or so if they need to show their talent, but I'd say this is a bit overkill. Something You Got is a Chris Kenner cover that provides an alright start to this album, translating the bluesy original to a garage rock format. Work Song is an instrumental Nat Adderley cover that more so acts like filler in general, with some surf rock vibes to it. Louie Louie is the famous Kingsmen song covered here. It's a bit faster paced and the vocals sound almost identical, but it doesn't sound as well done as the original. But whatever, it's a cover on a debut, who cares? And plus, I've heard the chorus so many times it is stuck in my head, I will never ever forget it. Don't Break My Balloon is the first original song we hear, and it shifts a bit from what we've been hearing so far, because it follows a slower sort of tempo, and actually feels a bit psychedelic in some aspects without breaking the overall blues rock tone. I believe Markley actually did have writing on this song because in comparison to others on this album, this is one of the weirder ones. The lyrics are just "break my balloon" over and over, sung in various wailing tones, and although this is a bit before the Doors hit the scene with their self-titled debut, the overall progression of this song is reminiscent of the later half of The End. You Really Got Me is, well, another cover. I know the hook of this song like is chiseled into my brain, so I'm not too happy to hear it again, but there's some good moments, like a wild-ass guitar solo, and in general, a good amount of innovation on this one, I gotta say. And then we get a good chunk of original tracks. Don't Let Anything Stand in Your Way is a nice, cool, calm song. I Won't Hurt You is probably one of the best off this album, if not the best, with an unusual vocal structure and a mellow and well-done instrumental. If You Want This Love is probably my second favorite song on this album, since it sounds closest to the psychedelic tone that the band goes for later in their discography, and it's also one of the most polished songs here. You can tell that they put more effort into this song than some of the others. Insanity is a dad-rocky, harmonica-heavy, spoken word mess. It's not causing excessive lacerations to my tympanic membrane, but if I had to diagnose any symptoms caused by subjecting myself to this specimen, it would be a headache. The last two songs are Bob Dylan covers, Baby Blue and She Belongs to Me. You can tell the band is just trying to perform up to par with the original because the vocal style changes drastically to fit these songs, but like almost everything else on this album, they're alright. The main issues I would have with this album is besides the handful of original pieces on this, you don't find anything original. It's very plausible that Laughing Wind didn't aim to be a trend-setting band, that they simply wanted to play some fun rock music, but simply being from the time doesn't mean you're that good. Are they competent? Yes. Do they sound decent? Yeah. Is this the start that will tell you all you need to know about their direction from here on? No. I suppose one good thing that can be said about Bob Markley's influence around this time is that he gave the band a 3-album deal with Reprise Records and funded them wherever he saw fit, including getting some reportedly impressive light shows that helped to gain them a following in Los Angeles. His influence and simple presence did cause a bit of tension within the band because, again, They probably didn't want to be just another wacky psychedelic rock group, and Mark Lee's weird personality and lack of instrumental achievements besides tambourine and bongos didn't help things either. But they let him stay because he got them the right connections. However, the group were mostly known at the time for those aforementioned light shows and their concerts, and they never did get far outside of Los Angeles with their fan base or their music. Initially, Mark Lee wanted the band to be the West Coast version of the Velvet Underground, and while that did get them slightly popular with the Los Angeles crowd, as I said before, and the band did find themselves signed by Reprise Records, a label owned by— oh please, Lord of unholy fuck. That vision meant that Mark Lee had to send them right to work, releasing their second album in 1967 titled Part 1.
Part 1, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
Why name your album Part 1 when you already have a Volume 1 and could have just named this album Volume 2? Who knows. The main point is, this is where things start to get interesting musically, because they ditch their garage rock bluesy style in favor of tackling the cleaner, experimental, psychedelic wave rising up at the time. At this point, Mark Lee had confirmed and total control of what went on the album and what did not. Mark Lee was one weird mofo, as I have said before, both in his personality and his taste, and given how much of a disconnect the music on Part 1 takes compared to Volume 1, all fingers point to him. What you hear is what he's reviewed. Now, I'm using the 2001 remaster for the background music and preview tracks, since this band is obscure enough to where original versions of their songs are hard to find online. Either way, the main points I want to make will be based around what I hear from this version, so if you guys have any input at all, I'd be glad to see it in the comments. This album didn't really follow the psych rock trend of having long epic songs, although the songs on here do follow the same type of structure. These don't go any longer than 3 minutes, save for one which is a cover of a Frank Zappa track, and even then that's less than 4.5 minutes. Shifting Sands is the first song, and it definitely notes a large change from Volume 1, not just a gradual one. The structure of this song embodies the 60s in a nutshell, from the bass line to the collected drumming to the heavy reverb of the guitar solos and of course the vocals, who I'm still not entirely sure to this day if it's Sean or Danny Harris who did them. Every member in this band has vocal credits save for Mark Lee, who only has spoken word and backing vocals, so it's possible they alternate between different vocalists from this album, but if so, they all sound alike. Not in a bad sense though. Anyway, Shifting Sands is great, then we get a re-recorded version of I Won't Hurt You, which is trippy as hell. This is the most mellow and minimalistic rock song I think I've ever heard. The original was just like any other song, albeit better crafted. Here, it's mostly only guitars save for a heartbeat. Yeah, they use a heartbeat as percussion. It's weird, dude.
I've lost all of my pride. I've been to paradise and out the other side. With no—
Now you may be saying, hey, didn't I hear that in that one trailer for that one movie made by the same guy who did that one movie with the soundtrack that had the Beach Boys on it?
I've been in this town so long and back in the city I've been taking.
Yes. Anyways, how many songs contain an actual heartbeat as the percussion? It's definitely a standout track. Is it better than the original version? Hell yes. Is it a bit more pretentious? Hell yes. But with a band like—
Insert long readout of band name here.
you're gonna get—
Insert ironic one-liner about Andy Warhol that implies modern art is garbage here.
Oh, but if you thought that was weird, wait until you hear 1906, a spoken word song written by both Mark Lee and a session member named Ron Morgan. I really can't describe its sound accurately enough, so here's a preview of the track.
A circus light keeps flashing. A stone stumbled and fell. Steel beams snapping through. I don't feel right.
It's, yeah. So you got a general idea of what the main body sounds like. I'm at a loss for words. Oh, but if you thought that was weird, wait until you hear this. A cover of Frank Zappa's Help I'm a Rock. Hearing the two songs back to back, they don't really sound like each other at all besides the hook line and the chaotic trance-inducing structure.
Help I'm a rock.
I applaud the WCPAEB for making a cover that sounds original, but damn. Comparing those two songs is like comparing a mashed up banana inside an avocado to 2 almonds and a Beretta pistol. What are you supposed to say? This track has some funny lines included, even if the delivery of them is somewhat cringe at first to hear. Like one of the members playing a monologue of a rock that says it might become a police officer.
What a drag it is, being a rock. I think I'm gonna be a cop and go up and get my driver's license and pick up some freaks in front of Pandora's box.
And if you thought that was weird, it still is. It's probably one of the weirdest additions to this album. We then get a cover of Morning Dew by Bonnie Dobson? Okay, I was gonna say Grateful Dead, but that'd probably make me grateful to be dead when the comment section is done with me. Once again, this cover doesn't sound a lot like the original, save for the melody and some of the lyrics. Kinda. It's also been renamed into Will You Walk With Me, which is odd renaming a song to name a cover, but alright, to each his own.
Will you walk with me in the morning, to my love? Will you walk with me in the morning, to my love? Don't worry about the people anymore. You'll never see the people anymore.
Also, is it just me, or have the lyrics been simplified by like a ton? Don't worry about the people anymore, you'll never see the people anymore? I didn't get hit in the head where I suddenly need to be shown a level 3 scholastic version of a song's message. Okay, that being said, the song on its own is pretty good. It's a slower song in between 2 quicker ones, but for the overall mood and tone this album established so far, it fits right in. Transparent Day right off the bat sounds like it predates many 80s sitcom intros with its opening melody, and the rest of the song doesn't stray too far from that image. Easily the most cookie-cutter track on this album, which I'm actually surprised to say given Markley's eccentric selection of material so far. I don't want to make the video all about him, since the other members no doubt had at least some say, right? But when you, for lack of a better term, take over a whole band's direction, it's hard not to be mentioned when it comes to the material your band produces. Kinda like the Downfall Network. Brody! Oh, right, nothing to say about Transparent Day. Lila is another weird track, I only need to play this part.
I love to see you are my life.
Oh yeah, I guess I do have something to say. Somebody must have really messed up in the studio when making this track, because it sounds like another song is starting right in the middle. The guitar playing is offbeat enough to make me think something new is starting, but then that idea commits Sudoku almost as quickly as it came, leading back to the original song. Is there a reason? I know I don't need one, and I'm stupid for asking for one, but I'm convinced that somebody messed up and misplaced one of the recordings on the master tapes, and then bam! Mistake sent out to the world. Or at least Los Angeles. Here's Where You Belong is basically like Transparent Day in everything except the structure. Verse, chorus, you know the drill. If you've heard Transparent Day, you've heard this one. If You Want This Love is probably my second favorite song off this album. It's a remake of another song they performed on Volume 1, and to be honest, there's not that much difference besides production between the two songs. Again, this version is more simplified than the original, although not to the level of taking away almost everything and adding only a heartbeat.
If you want this love of mine, treat me gentle and treat me kind. Don't be mean and don't be bad, and you'll get the truest love that you ever had.
Excuse Me Miss Rose is another filler song. High Coin is another cover, this time performed rather close to the original. Great job, band. All in all, not a bad album. A definite improvement over Volume 1 for sure. I'd put some of the songs like I Won't Hurt You, Shifting of the Sands, and Will You Walk With Me as some of the band's greatest, with others like Lila, Help I'm a Rock, and 1908 as perfect tracks to show off how weird they can be on here. So, because of his general dissatisfaction with Markley's attitude and musical talent, Michael Lloyd left the group before recording sessions for the next album began. This marked the beginning of the decline for the group, since initially Laughing Wind was a simple collaboration of friends with different musical ideas in a sort of melting pot. And Markley was the wedge that made a split in the band artistically. More was to happen in this story thread after their next album release titled Volume 2.
Part 2.
It's Volume 2, you dolt.
The West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
You have a perfectly round tongue, painted green, and a fountain, and a mountain, and a tunnel for me to follow.
Why not name this album Volume 3 or just have a different album title, seeing as how this is their third studio album and they shot themselves in the foot naming their second album Part 1? Who knows? All I know is, this is going to be confusing to convey to my crush if she ever asks what type of music I'm into, let alone if she ever talks to me at all. What does the band bring to the table on this album? Yes. It's hard to exactly say what this band was doing besides being weird just to be weird. Was it a trend at the time to be weird musically? Yeah. Are they bandwagoners at this point? Arguably, yeah. But does this sound like the same band we heard before? No. Let's begin our strange expedition into this album by skipping the first track and going straight to Suppose They Give a War and No One Comes. This song is haunting, from the bass line to the various sound effects to the chanting chorus. In the beginning, the band claims it's an African tribal chant they wrote, then some weird gibberish is spoken which is definitely not African.
This is an African tribal chant that we wrote called Suppose They Give a War and No One Comes.
Besides that ridiculous part, this is a typical anti-war hippie song, although that's really hard to say because this song, relative to the rest of the discography, is anything but typical. They feature some heavily distorted guitars in the mix, everything rises in intensity as the song progresses. It just puts me on edge. Good song. Ridiculous, but good song.
Suppose they give a war, and no one comes.
The third track, Buddha, is short and features some odd lyrics and a lean towards a more atmospheric tone. In fact, the album in general tends to lean more on the ambient, atmospheric side of things than on the technicality of the instruments. Part 1 in comparison to this is like what you think an acid trip would be like, and Volume 2 is your nihilistic outlook following said acid trip. Smell of Incense accomplishes the same feeling. It's weird, it's a disconnect from the sound we had before, and yet here it's definitely more mature. You can tell the band is more serious on this album than on Part and Volume 1. These songs just immerse you in a world of the time, the hippie age, the anti-war gatherings, everything. It's like The Doors, but this time when this album came out, The Doors were a thing, and it's okay to actually say that this sounds like The Doors. I haven't really been rendered without words by an album before, and this album still has stuff to be said about it, but it comes the closest to leaving me speechless. The overall sound is also a return to their garage rock roots, which mixes itself well with the reverb and the unpredictable structures. There's more conventional songs here that still contain that reverb-heavy, spacious sound, such as Queen Nymphette, which has some concerning lyrics, let's say that for the sake of foreshadowing.
When you're older, we'll have a time. When you're older, there'll be a place for us.
Unfree Child is another avant-garde, garagey song that frankly I zoned out through for most of it. It's better than simply being bored, I suppose. Markley himself sings solo on this one, which is easy to spot. His singing, not that great compared to some of the other members.
Unfree child,
silently in an unfree world, waiting patiently.
Carte Blanche is crazy and energetic, another song that you can easily zone out to, which I should note is another problem for this album. As great as the songs are, it's too easy to get lost in them. It's way too easy for them to pass you by. Maybe it's a lack of punch to them or something, but I figured for an album that I enjoy a lot, I'd name some tracks that actually had names that stuck with me. Delicate Fawn. It's another song where you definitely notice Markley's writing to a borderline disturbing degree, yet overall the song is alright. It actually contains some bagpipe appearances near the end, which is something the album hadn't employed before that point. And the last track is called Tracy Had a Hard Day Sunday. What day is it? Okay, my final verdict is that this album, although great and a leap forward for the band artistically as well as quality-wise, suffers in my opinion because of the easiness of just letting it play and not really noticing it. No tracks grate my eardrums, none are anything short of okay, and there are a good deal of good songs here, but it's just too all over the place, and really, with that in mind, this album doesn't work that cohesively unlike part 1. Also, to mention, there's a great deal of songs here that either sound like the group took inspiration from The Doors, or other bluesy, psychedelic rock bands of the time, and less of their own original ideas. I'm not saying I don't like that the album is not as focused as before, because by many means this is a great release. But its strengths are also its weaknesses, and so I kinda have to say it's good, but I recommend it more for background music than a serious, full attentive listen. Regardless of how well their album had been received, they still weren't successful and had never really been too successful, so let's just say it wasn't really big when it released. The band continued to break apart. Sean Harris wasn't really pleased with what his outputs to the band had been used for. As quoted by a CD booklet for the next album, "There would be times when you would just have a good melody and you would think, I don't want to waste it on this." Regardless, he did stick with the band. However, his brother Dan had health issues around this point and had to take some time off, with his condition being described by Sean as a sort of manic-depressive illness. So basically, the band was an active three-piece by the time they started working on their next release, which would be their final album for their 3-record deal for Reprise Records. This one, released in 1968, is titled Volume 3. Why not name this album Volume 4 or Butterfly Mind based on the artwork or something else, seeing as how this is their technical 4th studio album and they should have made this one Part 2 to fit a bit with their discography so far? I mean, yeah, Volume 3, 3rd album on Reprise, but seriously, can somebody come up with an actual album title for once? Anyways, by this time the band stopped doing much of their live performances and instead chose to become a studio band. For this album they got John Van Hammersveld, the artist who did the cover art for Magical Mystery Tour, okay, which is cool because this artwork symbolizes how minimized the band became in this period. Okay, that is a bit harsh, but really, with less members working on this album, and audibly so, that joke needed to be said. I guess for the most part, this is as close to a continuation of the prior album as you can get. There's less of the droning and trancing feeling to these songs, but it's still present. It's gotten a bit more subtle than before, but it's also more conventional rock music than Volume 2 was. You still do get the psychedelic Doors-esque vibes here again, somewhat more so because the use of a sitar and guitars played in the style of sitars have been increased, notably on the title track, A Child's Guide to Good and Evil.
After the doors of many strange rooms have been bolted and locked, when you come back, dragging your daydreams behind you, I'll give you a new shiny face and a yellow brick road. The rest of the world is wrong, and don't let anyone change you.
With all that basic description down, this album is less eventful than Volume 2. On Volume 2, there was still some enthusiasm to the album in a sense. Here you can tell that Sean Harris and other members of the band save for Markley were clearly not doing all they could, since most of it probably would have been hijacked by the latter during the production stages. That being said, there's still value and listenability to this thing, mainly made so by the simple instrumental talent of the members involved. What the album lacks in pull factor and exciting moments, it makes up for in that it's probably easier to access than some of their others. It's a good entry point into the band since everything on Volume 1 and arguably Part 1 has been forgotten at this stage in the band's songwriting process and career overall. Part 1 remains one of their best albums in my opinion, but I think Volume 3 is probably the most accessible you'll find from this band. I can't really commend much about this album besides the fact that it's easy to listen to and it's standard late 60s psychedelic rock at its most stripped down and emotionless. There does remain weird moments that keep the band iconic, like our drummer always plays In the Nude, which is undoubtedly written primarily by Markley.
I like very comfortable girls who are straight, but not quite. Who are ready for new adventures, ready for the altogether unexpected. I'm kind but not too gentle. I'm gentle but not too nice.
A Child of a Few Hours is Burning to Death, which is probably the same deal. As Kind as Summer is weird for the sake of being weird, with a slowed down section abruptly beginning in the middle.
About good and about evil.
And finally, there is 1.5 minutes of silence at the end, which is the song Anniversary of World War III. Yeah. It means stuff, ooh! After the end of the world, there's silence. I don't need to be smacked in the face to get that. And I certainly didn't need to check if there was some sort of error with my player. So for the most part, album's okay. Some people regard this as the band's greatest achievement, which I do not get. How does going more listener-friendly constitute as greatest work yet? Sure, Ron Morgan had a greater hand than ever in making this album with his talents, but beyond that little tidbit, it's fine. That's about it. Sean Harris eventually decided, you know what, I'm gonna do what I want to do for a while, and made a new band with his brother Dan, naming it the California Spectrum. He wanted to go on tour and perform live more because being a studio band under Markley's control wasn't really cutting it for him. According to the CD booklet, which is a bible for this retrospective when it comes to the most accurate information I can find, Sean apparently thought Markley's ultimate aim was just to have an album to show to some girls in LA and bring them up to his house. He wasn't prepared to go out of town and play gigs. He thought the Sunset Strip was the coolest place on earth, and he was fixated with hustling girls. Yeah, so at this point it was clear that Markley wasn't really mentally there. I had already explained at the beginning that his motive simply for creating the band was to get girls, and one would think that would change over time as he actually started making music, or at least having a hand in it. It certainly seemed that way when Volume 2 came around. Markley seemed like he was in it now for the music, albeit having total control over whatever came out of the band. But no, his aim had always been to pick up chicks, just like a true playboy. He had the money to do it too, so what was stopping him? Anyways, California Spectrum toured and performed, the pop art band was put on hold for a while, and because of Volume 3's surprising lack of success, Reprise Records dropped them from their catalog. So the West Coast pop art experimental band probably should have gone by now. But oh ho ho, don't underestimate these people, because despite the lack of success and the negative atmosphere in recording sessions, the band regrouped together with Danny Harris and also Michael Lloyd. Yeah, Michael Lloyd also returned to the band. So in essence, the original lineup plus Ron Morgan was back. They also got signed to Amos Records, at the time a brand new label formed by Jimmy Bowen. Surely this would lead to a great album.
Where's my daddy? Where did he go? It's 5 below in the Kansas City snow. I'll have to drive all night to get to Tulsa.
I'm uncomfortable. There's little information about this album besides the concept and some events surrounding it. Okay, this is a concept album about a homeless girl named Patty. Before I get to the story, let's talk about the music itself first. Instrumentally, the performance is much more energetic than on the last album by far. It's got a more folk rock tone to it than a somber psychedelic avant-garde atmospheric tone, which serves to keep interest up overall. It's even more conventional than the last album, which shows further maturity in the band's sound, but with that comes the added baggage of being more generic. And here on this album, it's not too much of a far cry to compare this band with so many others that pull off the same style. In a non-specific world, if somebody said, hey, put on a 60s psychedelic album, this is what you would hear over the audio system. Besides the concept, there's nothing really remarkable about the songwriting in terms of innovation at all. The first few songs are no more than like 2 minutes long, little warm-ups I guess. The first actual lengthy track at 3 minutes is My Dog Back Home, which is a chill, soft song that you've heard before, let's be honest. Give Me Your Love Thing is annoying. It's like the same line over and over again. What else would define annoying in this song's case?
Give me your love thing, let it ring. Give me your love thing, let it sing.
Everyone's Innocent Daughter begins with the traditional name this album followed by the name of the band thing that I keep neglecting to mention. I have no idea why, but Markley wanted for each album to say something like, Part 1, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. He's done this for all the albums. In fact, here's a quick little montage of it.
Part 1, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. Part 2, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. You've been listening to the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
Except instead of Markley saying it this time, here it's a little girl, presumably Patty, reading it out.
Part 4, West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
Okay? Point album? You even got the fucking part wrong! The song itself is filled with innuendos like lollipops, and even the title itself, I mean come on, a middle schooler could pick up on those. It's on this track that actually seems like the concept is being followed because for the most of the songs prior, you would not think it's a concept album with a story at all. You just think it's like any other album with disconnected songs. There's parts where the band rips off other bands like the Beach Boys unsuccessfully, such as Have You Met My Pet Pig?
Place to park between Dale and Clark. Dip, giddy up, giddy up, dip, dip, giddy up, giddy up, for you. Begins at 10. Dip, dip, giddy up, dip, dip, giddy up.
Okay, in story terms, on the song Coming of Age in LA, it's revealed through the lyrics that little Patty, the little girl that's on the cover of this album, according to the story anyways, was beaten, raped, and robbed, and now has to plead her case to an alcoholic judge. Dark? Yeah. But the mood is way too bright and happy in the music for the story to have any impact whatsoever. In fact, the delivery of these lines that actually explains what happens at this point in the story sounds so frickin' rushed. And to top it all off, the album just stops. There's no real end, no indication of a finish, it just stops. It's like the album was cut in half. This is easily the least exciting album by this band. This is a good example of how Bob Markley's direction hurt the band, because this, beyond the creepiness, is as bland as the yolk of a straight-boiled egg. And again, this wasn't a success, this time with good reason, because this really wasn't meant to be one. Something weird must have happened, because I find it a stretch to say that this band would actually make an album like this. This is so disconnected from their prior material that I wonder if I'm even listening to the same band. Thus ended the story of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. and thus began the story of the crowning achievement of Markley's schnozziness. Wait, was that offensive according to The Guardian? Fuck! Anyways, for whatever reason, the band switched to Forward Records for their next album, which for whatever reason was supposed to be their self-titled, until Bob Markley, for whatever reason, insisted the band change the name of the album to Markley a Group, and the band's name to Markley. Michael Lloyd was still around, but at this point everybody involved was not feeling like sticking around in the band. Yet they decided to work on this last album under the new name. In a business sense, Markley was thinking, for whatever reason, that under a new name the band could gain a new audience or a clean slate, but he was already notarized at that time for being a douche. Then again, maybe he also thought his notoriety would help the group. For whatever reason, these changes happened. In 1970, the band, now under the name Markley, released Markley a Group.
Look out for interplanetary spaceships and magnetic storms. Some sort of advanced warning system should be set up.
Some say this is just a Bob Markley solo album, but I kinda consider this the last album of the West Coast pop art experimental band, because it's really an album by them, it's not a Markley solo album by any means. Markley the person still has the writing here that plagued their prior albums as well as notable vocal parts, but the other members considerably improve everything here. Michael Lloyd does a better job with guitars, Danny Harris sings really well despite the predatory lyrics, and the music overall is done much better than on Where's My Daddy. There actually sounds like enthusiasm and purpose is in this band again on this album, and it feels great. This is what the last album should have been in reality. Roger the Rocket Ship is the first instance where I can actually enjoy what I'm hearing, instrumentally and vocally. Lyrically, my god, Markley really loves teenage girls, doesn't he? Even at the age of 34 or 35 by this album's release. Anyways, I don't let this affect my liking of this song too much. There's some ambient sound effects added that make this track stand out a great bit.
Look out for me, I'll tear you apart. Look out for me, I have no heart. Hello, my dear, you know I'm here. I'm Rocket the Roger Ship. Oh, Roger the Rocket Ship.
Elegant Ellen features some vocal layering at the end of the song that's haunting. Sarah the Sad Spirit features some string orchestral backing that works really well alongside the soft vocals and bass line. Overall, it's a good song. In fact, most of the tracks that appear on this album are done well. Again, it's as if you're listening to a totally different band, but at least this time it's in a good way, not in an exhausted way. Truck Stop is weird, but at least it's somewhat funny in its weirdness. Zoom 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 features lyrics that seem somewhat hypocritical of Markley to write, even if he only shares a co-writing credit with Danny Harris. I mean, this line is just a bit odd for a playboy who assumes total control of a band to say.
Money, 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 tear it to pieces. Money, 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 I don't care at all. Funny, 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 zoom, zoom, zoom. Funny, 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 zoom, zoom, zoom.
Also, it's another hilariously weird track near the end. This band wasn't really a drug rock band, as I've said before, but you gotta be on drugs to think of something like this. Sweet Lady 11 has a predictable structure, like amazingly predictable for what it is. Take a listen to this and tell me if you haven't heard a song that has similar progression to this.
Yeah, sweet lady 11, you're the best girl I've ever seen. You're the best girl in town, the best girl around. My.
The Magic Cat features some group backing vocals that are reminiscent of 1906 off of Part 1. Beyond that, it's fairly repetitive and meh. To close off the album, there's a remake of Outside Inside from the prior album, which right off the bat is easy to tell that it's a far, far better version of the song than the original was.
Outside, inside, all around.
All in all, this was a good album. Maybe a little inferior to Volume 3, but still a very good place to start listening to the band. The band decided to call it quits the same year a group released, this time for good, as the members all went separate ways, still in their youth. This group did appear on compilation albums as years went on, and recent interest prompted a 2011 companion release. Michael Lloyd got a job as a vice president at MGM Records, doing production work, and later working on movie soundtracks. The Harris brothers and Ron Morgan continued making music with some of their portfolio, including some impressive listings. Bob Markley, however, lived out the rest of his days as an eccentric Playboy record producer, having to avoid the police a few times for undisclosed incidents involving underage girls.
Well, imagine my shock!
His reputation as the guy who screwed over the band and had a really weird eccentric personality persisted until his death in 2003. And thus, for real, ends the story of the West Coast pop art experimental band. Arguably a true novelty of their time, to be frank. Their good material is very overlooked, and their not so good material is primarily the reason why this band had such a tough time. This band deserves so much more, to be honest. Even with Markley's unfair treatment of the rest of the members, and his outright scummy motives for such, if the band had gotten popular, maybe stayed on Reprise, or gotten to some bigger labels at the time, they might have been considered one of the greats, just like the Velvet Underground. Markley had an eye for business, it was just too focused sightseeing to realize what to do in order to have the band grow. Ultimately, this group is an overlooked gem in the pile. Were they spectacular? Not really. But did the cadre of musically minded young adults deserve the fate they got? Definitely not. This band had talent, and at least the surviving members found success, so it all worked out in the end. In the words of Markley, sometimes to get somewhere, you gotta take advantage of the young ones. Wait, what?
You're too young. You're just a child. A grain of sand. A willow still bending. Go on alone.
Down.